Is not for the committee, just as a liaison?
No, Brian, like, no,
No, not Brian,
We
no,
haven't-
Robinson. What's the name?
no, Dave
No,
Kibbe
Dave
is
Kibbe.
gonna do some
What
committee
do you think?
assistance.
Oh,
But Brian Robinson, right, Brian's not here, Brian is on the committee.
Both Brian's are on the
Both.
committee. Yeah,
Well, Brian Lightbody hasn't been officially appointed.
right. So, okay, right. So say that would be up to the.
Um,
He is, so at this point,
Okay, so the life has
support.
um, right.
But then I actually
Yeah.
found other mountain designs that I might, I want to, but this is, it comes in elements.
You can start, you can. I'm
We
just-
can start.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna call the meeting to order at 12:12 on 12:28. So. Well, I'm trying to call the meeting to order. A little bit like a classroom. So did everybody have the opportunity to review minutes from our 11:30
Yes,
meeting?
I did.
Were there any edits or comments or changes that should be noted for our secretary to change?
None that I saw, and if there's not, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Somebody has a second.
Usually the chair doesn't unless they have to. So, all right, so all in favor? So moved. So the next thing is select board liaison updates. Anything happen? Well, a big storm that we should know about from previous board meeting or things coming up that are pertinent to us, and perhaps, if appropriate, an update on the violation on Bayview Street, please. If it's, well, it's technically not Bayview Street, it's
At the
Metcalf.
Metcalf, thanks. If appropriate, just because it.
Yeah, there was a, brief update at our select board meeting, but, mostly the conversation stopped pretty quickly because, there's so much, sort of enthusiasm about diving into different scenarios that it's really not wise for
No,
the town to, at this point, we're still in the fact finding
gotcha.
phase and, but yeah, certainly a lot of,
I don't want to advance speculation. here.
appropriate level of concern,
Yeah.
I would say, and, if it gets to the point where, there's any kind of a plan on the table, I will make sure to give this group as much of an update as is appropriate or I'm allowed.
Yeah, fair.
But yeah, lots of different agencies and individuals involved, and everybody seems to be perfectly notified.
There was a great aerial photo they had of it. Did you see that? There's an aerial photo that looks, looking down at, it must have been a drone shot or something, and you can clearly see.
The
Yeah.
change in the landscape.
You can clearly see which trees are not.
Trees.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Oh, where was that? Did you see that?
Augur had it.
Oh,
Okay,
Yeah, I don't think that's actually anything that,
it's probably
you might be the only one that's seen that.
Yeah.
It was just a drone shot looking down at it.
It's interesting. I can speak to, there was a meeting there, looked to be a discovery meeting there this morning. There's a lot of cars in Lake Beach.
Yeah,
So, but I do like the idea of staying involved because it.
well, I mean, it's certainly a conservation concern. It's a shoreland. It's,
And
adjacent to public property.
Right.
And so I think it's just, and for us could be an opportunity to share the importance of buffers on shorelines and the impact of improperly using chemicals because there's always a place for them, and the judicious use is like there's, but, you know, and this is an unfortunate example as to why.
Yeah, and how socially unacceptable it is to do something like that. You know, I mean, just not gonna do
That is actually
Whether
kind
or
of
not,
like,
no, I was just saying whether or not we could, you know, make any recommendations to change or strengthen any
That's my,
existing ordinances.
that was my thinking too, with like going forward. I was thinking of this just after the incident on Atlantic Ave. I mean, it's just like, it seems like it's, in the past, I remember way back when, before anyone were on the select board,
I actually have an idea.
when the former head of the credit card company who's lived on Baker Street just
Yeah,
blatantly just cut down all those trees, just, yeah, big thing. It was worth, the fine was worth cutting down all these trees.
Right, I was gonna say, I don't know.
And it just seems like that fine is not
High
a
enough?
deterrent
Yeah.
and should be different.
what I was to add to that is the tree, the tree policy, stuff, shade tree policy has penalties for that kind of stuff, and they're extremely artificially low. So that may be something that could be a recommendation, that there's a stricter fine for limbs and trees. Because it's broken down into, it's X amount of dollars for a limb and X amount of dollars for a tree, and it's like peanuts, it's like $20 or some very low number. It's, I can't even remember, but it's.
is that how we somewhat calculated this current fee?
No, like the Atlantic Ave
Atlantic
was,
Ave.
like, was an example. We had to use what the ordinance says, what
Yeah.
the shade tree policy says, and it's written in there what the penalty is. And it's not really much of a, penalty
Well, yeah, I mean,
for
and that
the
was,
tree part.
right, it's kind of like a one size fits all cookie cutter approach without the opportunity to kind of assess, that some trees might be more important than others, and some limbs might be more important than others, and sort of the overall impact. That was public property, not so much. We used the shade tree ordinance because that kind of seemed to make sense, but there, also could have gone the trespassing route or the vandalism
Yeah.
route or but yeah, certainly, I mean, overall updates to the shoreline zoning ordinance and different overlays and different ways of protecting the shoreline, both the ocean
Yeah,
and streams, and it kind of goes along with everything we've been trying to do with those smaller streams too. But the only other thing I would say with an update, we could talk about this more when we get to the pier stuff, but this is the yacht club after the storm. And, it's very typical at the yacht club to have things like, seaweed.
Yeesh.
That, that ends up there all the
We
time.
just paid that too.
Right, but you can see.
Well, so what, there was a dock down?
There was a pier
There's a
here,
pier.
yeah. And this pier was actually one that was approved. I have to look back, but it went through the process of the harbor committee, and they tried to, they assessed the impact, and there was concern because of the sailing program, and ultimately the pier got approved. And for several years now, you can see here's the granite part. Little bits and pieces of it fall off all the time. But finally, this time, it's completely fell off, and pieces of it are all smashed up everywhere. There are nails. There's
So wooden pier,
yeah. So when we look at the potential impact when you have storm events like this,
Look at that.
we're not really, there's no mechanism in place to have, we don't have the resources to have somebody going out all the time and inspecting these piers and making sure that they're not going to fall apart. There's really very little way to guarantee that they're not going to fall apart. But it's just such a bigger problem to clean up after these storms when it's all of this man-made stuff. Than when it's, you're just taking rockweed. But the yacht club is a pretty good example of, I mean, this is just,
Did water get in the building?
Oh, good,
Sure.
sure. Come over
I
too.
can't imagine
Yeah.
it didn't. I
I
mean,
think
it was,
that-
it was
And
completely.
because that's
surrounded.
the town-owned buildings, I think maybe that goes, some review, if there's property damage, that would be historic resources. But obviously it's harbor front, so it's conservation minded too, so that's one of those, that's a very unique property. I mean, would you say, is there anything conservation minded that we should be thinking about?
I'm thinking about the impact of piers, I guess,
yeah.
overall, in terms of, and, shoreline zoning and the floodplain ordinance, and just kind of understanding that the reason for, when we talk about like flooding and the impact on, I think oftentimes people think, oh, it's just the impact is only to the property owner. And there's a reason why these rules exist, not just to protect the property owner, so to speak, but the impact on the adjacent properties too. There was a propane tank that was floating in the condo parking lot. All of these things, like, there's a real threat, I would say, to the environment when you have things that are in the floodplain and then they get flooded and then the contents leak out and they're destroyed and then they get washed all around everywhere. And I think that people don't realize that a lot of the time, and that we could be working to,
Where would the propane tank from? No.
it's for the, what do you call it? The condos, they're,
The rental properties or whatever.
The ones over by Lion Morris or the ones?
no,
by-
I'll show you
Well, I feel like part of our job as a
Oh, those
committee,
condos,
these
is-
condos.
Yep.
I mean, that's directly in the,
Wow, look at that
there
concrete.
should not be a parking garage.
No.
That's the,
No.
I mean, that's part of
Yeah.
our.
This was the Lock Marina, years and years ago. And then when that was kind of retired, they built condos on top. This is also where, that Belmont Brook, the one that we talked about
I wonder
before,
there's so much extra flooding. I mean, I always see it flooded in there and wonder how it's.
that comes in, there's two massive culverts right here.
That,
And so,
that structure did not sound anymore.
That's
Well-
so, it's built in a river. And there's a river in the south, thing that's running under Fly Street.
Oh, yeah.
And that's coming. I mean, there used to be a wet marina. But I think Allison, what you said it perfectly, if there's a threat to the environment, I think our job with regard to the peers and environment, especially town-owned property, is to speak for the environmental,
right,
and I think that's what I'd like to, I don't know if we want to jump right to the peer stuff, but I think that's part of our job in forming an opinion and speaking about the environment and our recommendations for the peers. But I also say for town-owned properties too, not to discuss today, but is there anything environmentally, that yacht club property is so unique because it's pretty far out into the harbor and it has a right angle that forms that pocket. And so waves come and that damages every year. So is there something that is that just an inevitable, I hate to be in a position to sit here and say, oh, it's just gonna happen or is there a conservation based, can we do some help out or advise or rather than
I mean, there are people that would say that the right thing to do there is some kind of managed retreat situation. I mean,
a water retreat, so,
moving that building somewhere else, or if we are gonna try to protect that, there's actually a submerged land lease that goes along with
interesting.
that. So, I mean, that's all just filled in. It was the harbor, it was filled in, and a building was put on top of it, just like
Wow.
Harvard, just like Lower Harbor Park.
Wow.
The owners did it around the same time before we kind of knew any better. So yeah, I mean, I think in the long term, we have
That
a
might be-
historic resources committee that advises the town on you know, his properties that the town owns that are on the historic
Well, that could come up under sort of public access.
register.
Yeah.
Different Public access, but it is public
Totally, it's public,
access.
and,
You know,
and
I mean,
think
it's a different way of thinking about it, but we could address that again.
Lake Beach is one of those things,
Mhm.
which is like.
Yeah.
If we were given the ability to build a pier at Lake Beach, would we even do that?
Yeah, well, that'll come up, yeah. So,
Right, so, yeah.
um,
That's just overall.
But yes, that's interesting. I think that's something we can talk later specifically about.
But so, yeah, there was a big storm. There's an environmental impact from that. Lots of things flooded. We should probably at some point address that or try to document the different things that happen on properties when these storms happen. But that's my report.
So who gets to clean it up?
Good question.
so, yeah, these are my kind of sort of writing some things down. as we go.
Generated material, right?
I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. That's, you know, the yacht club is another one of those arrangements where it's not, it's a lease to the yacht club. So the town owns it, but the yacht club is responsible.
And what do they pay the town, $1 a year or something?
No, they pay 20-something thousand a year.
Would the yacht club be responsible if the decision was to raise that building on stilts? Would that be whose expense would that come from? Like if
That would have to be a larger thing. What we discovered actually recently is that the yacht club lease was never approved by voters. So it was, the select board doesn't have the authority to enter into long-term contracts. But first they did anyway, at some point, and it should have gone to a town meeting, to a full town vote, like it did with the Chamber of Commerce building, things like that. So that was kind of an oversight that we discovered recently when we were discussing who was going to pay for the parking lot repair and for that. So yeah, and at some point they'll, as with many things, there'll have to be a conversation about what happens there. There's the lease right now, it says that either party needs to give 20 years notice to terminate the lease. But it never,
Wow.
That's realistic.
it's crazy. I mean, yes, a little bit crazy, but
Perfect.
but it never went, the voters never got to approve that. So it would be interesting to see like what, if we were to put that out to voters right now, like, do you want to give the yacht club this lease of town and building? I think there'd be probably some skepticism
Oh, yeah.
about what's, in the best interest of. It was deeded to the town saying that it for use as a yacht club and for community benefit. So but it doesn't have to be a private yacht club. There's all, we can talk about it.
Okay.
Just coming up.
But on that note, we'll.
You've been documenting a bunch of the storm surges,
Yeah.
and so thank you for doing that, and posting it. And so I guess in trying to help you in documenting this stuff, best is get out there, take photos. Like, is that something we should be putting in the stormwater drain, or is that kind of a little bit different because it's a surge, or should we put that in there anyway?
Oh, you could put it in the field
Is that a good-
observations
Yeah,
layer.
I would definitely
Okay.
put it in.
I haven't been
field
doing that much, but that was the original time. Yeah, putting it in the.
Okay.
the-
I'm just
that-
thinking like these things happen. I think we had another meeting where
I
another
think
storm happened.
that's a good idea.
So
Mhm.
if we're out there taking photos, and we can help
Yeah,
just upload it there.
right, yeah, on
Yeah,
that field
just put a
observations
pin
layer.
right on the street where you are, or the location that you are, because then it really helps, put under the notes, what storm, day of, day after, a week later, kind of
Yeah.
thing, because I think that will
That'd be cool.
definitely help inform.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. I actually
Could
had
help
forgotten
people
about
in
that a
the
little
future.
bit. That's a great idea.
Approaches.
I've done that in like 4 spots just as a test when we first started this, but I haven't been. I
Yeah.
completely forgot about that. So that's a great idea.
Gosh, I know you do a lot of what you do, a ton of. so-
Right, but I should put it somewhere else besides my computer photos album and Facebook. So yeah, great.
All right, so next topic of discussion is the peer moratorium discussion, we have all, the committee was all given a copy of the Harbor Committee's response to the peer moratorium, which of course includes their recommendations. It was drafted in really well and with density, with, some subcategories of density, habitat, public access, and climate change or sea level rise as being kind of the overarching, and included a few appendix for us to, or for anyone to review. So my suggestion is that we, as a Conservation Commission, review it in those, with those categories in mind. And as I had indicated when I sent it out, that my hope is that the discussion is focused on those 4 areas and what the conservation needs, the messages, suggestions, improvements. How can we void this document, or create a response to the select board and the Harbor Committee that really helps reflect perhaps things that might be missing from it or could be added to it to make it better. So they're looking at it from one approach and we're looking at it from another. So the first would be the density. Said the harbor, it doesn't really, the current ordinance doesn't really address density of piers in the coastal harbor. And that they noted it has 4 additional, under current rules, 4 additional permits that have been outlined under Appendix A that could be potentially permitted and put in. And there's 1 that's already under permit. I went to every site without trespassing on the streets. To be publicly clear, I went down all the roads where all the piers could be. And I looked left, right, and said, so the one that's under permit is in phase 1. The likelihood of it being completed in 2023, I suspect, is fairly high. They did all of the initial stages. It's all fully permitted. So we can say that at this point that one is.
I don't think that's come to the select board yet. Which one?
Oh, it is.
You mean the one?
On Harbor Road.
Oh, yes, yeah, that one, yeah, that one's gonna happen.
Oh, no, it's, it's.
Is that not one of the ones
That they mentioned it as the 5th one, or the could be,
So they're
or
really-
permitted or whatever, so it's 4 more. That
and
could be.
3 of them are private.
3 of them are private and 1 of them is Lake Beach, so,
Well, when I think of density,
for sites, for potential sites.
yeah, I think of density, and maybe correct me if should be thinking about it differently, but I think about it as density of all things, not just piers. So I think of it piers, flows, moorings,
Of the harbor itself.
of the
or
harbor itself.
Yeah,
And so if we're gonna be adding a pier, we taking based on the length, I know it goes to no more than 6 feet. So I think when I think about density, I find the inner and coastal harbor to be a very dense harbor. And so looking at it now is, I think, somewhat misleading because of, it's
stuff is pulled out.
Pulled out. And we look at it in July and August. So it's really challenging for me to see a world in which we have any more additional private structures. Because I think the way to access our harbor, much like other harbors, is by a mooring field. Like it is actually, I think the appropriate way for man or woman, like just person, to access a harbor is by rowing or having a little dinghy rowing out to it. And a launch, and you keep your boat on a mooring, which is why we give those riparian rights 1 mooring. My suggestion is, rather than seeing, because of the density, I'd rather see one more mooring, so giving the property owner 2 moorings rather than giving them the right to a pier. Because I feel like the appropriate way to access our harbor, given its density, given its ecological properties, and many other, is to access by mooring ball, which is the attached vessel, not a mooring with a float. You know, a mooring ball that it has an attached vessel so that wildlife and other structures can, or other beings, can get by. And, because adding a float is like adding another boat. So I think density is, can we, but I also think that in looking at those 4, it would be, I think, a very wise decision. Because some of us have some expertise, some of us have some, you know, different complexes to hire an outside consultant to really look at the, you know, true, like, and because I could say it, like, you know, as an opinion, I guess, but if we had a third party expert to help us, I think that'd be amazing. And I think that, I really think this is a really big ordinance issue, and so I know there's some time constraints, but we could do it, but I think there's a density to me to sit here and say, oh yeah, we can fit it's 200 feet, only 300 feet this way, and there's nothing 600 feet or that way. It's like, I think it's much more than that. But that's what I think what's happened here is saying, oh, it goes out, it can only go 6 feet, it can only be so long, oh, it can only be so far adjacent. Okay, so this is a potential pier, but that's not taking into account anything other than. And so I feel like, I don't know, I'll stop there.
So does it identify what the,
Yes.
does it identify the reasons for, like, why is density important? Why is that something that needs to be? Because I could sit here and spew off like a million things about what I think, but looking at it seems to be that everybody in the past has agreed that density is something that we should be concerned with.
Because they're
So,
going
so
to harbor and
density-
August.
So what's the
So
reason?
according to the recommendations delivered by the Harbor Committee, under the caption, under the is density, it says density refers to how tightly packed the piers, docks, floats, ramps, and other structures are in the outer and coastal harbors. If the density is too high, existing scenic, aesthetic, recreational, or navigational uses of the harbors may be impacted. So you do reflect, you know, the definition of density when referring to.
I think that includes moorings.
Well.
I mean, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I
That's
would-
what
It seems like it's a balance. It's like, okay, if there's, depending on the number of moorings, the piers may have more or less of an impact. So if everybody agrees that that there is a point where it could be too much and it would impact all of these things, I mean, really what we're looking, there's no other way to say, I mean, it's subjective. It is subjective how much is too high.
Really?
I think there's
You only
science to
fit
it.
so many boats in a harbor at a time.
I think there's totally. a
We're near density already.
And you think about pollution from boats, there's definitely like
Oh, my opinion is we've already exceeded that,
I agree.
but not everybody
Yeah.
shares that opinion. So, trying to look at it, like if we can find, certain objective criteria, if there are any,
like, you know, I guess we could think about if there's some type of formula, and this is where I think a consultant might help, is say, okay, there's this amount of square footage space in the actual harbor of X amount of depth, and we have these wildlife species that live in our harbor, and they need based on a thriving population, they need this amount of space, you know, and you know, I don't know that math, but I think there is like definitely a science to understanding population growth and species that are living there. And I'd say even for thinking about ourselves and as a human being, I think there's also kind of science around pollution and navigation and you
To
know,
me, it
but-
comes down to a lot of the piers, it's, the impact is on square footage of hardened or modified shoreline also. So some piers are attached to ledge, and I think could be done in a way that is a very low impact. Theoretically, if I were to try to be
I see what you
open-minded
mean.
toward piers. Some require, most piers that I have seen in the harbor also come with a massive shoreline stabilization project, which if you take every time we do an erosion control project or a shoreline stabilization project, you're stopping that source of sedimentation, and which is a bad thing in some ways. We worry so much about erosion control, but we're also, we won't have a beach or if
Right.
every part of the harbor, we make it fixed in place forever. There are different types of shoreline stabilization, but we don't have a lot right now that regulates how that's done. So I guess, there's one pier that went in, it's like a float kind of pier that went in over on Sherman's Point. And that one could just be like unpinned from the ledge, and it's much lower impact than, so I don't know, I guess that to me, that's part of the density equation, is also, the impact on the shoreline. And
How come they don't do it more like a lake where, you can put your pier, your dock out in the summertime and then take it back in? I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, a lot of them have floats, a lot of them have a pier with a ramp.
But some of these dock systems that you put out have floats. I mean.
Yeah, right. You're saying that rather.
well,
than-
because it's so rough. I mean, the other thing is that what I've heard from a lot of people that live in the coastal harbor, live in these other places, they say, people would ask them why they never had a pier, and they said because they didn't want it to end up on Islesboro. And it's just so rough. I mean, that's why we take the floats in at Steamboat Landing. It's just, to me, it's the inner harbor is a little bit is much more protected. The outer harbor and the coastal harbor are just inappropriate for more structures because of the force of the waves
I guess a lot of them do have seasonal float systems, though. They have
that come up.
the
yeah.
pier that goes out, and then they have the gangway, and then they have the float. Usually, and they take the gangway and the float, because that's why they have that thing that goes across the end of the gangway.
I think one other question that we're missing out on here is, what is the public benefit of all these private piers?
Well, that right.
Well,
Is there
that's,
any?
that's an overarching question.
I mean, why do we want more? Who are they serving? And why do people who happen to own waterfront property have the right to have a pier into the middle of the harbor that is not owned by them? I mean, what's the benefit?
That's exactly, it used to be it was a property value thing, it was a property rights thing, it was a not wanting to diminish the property value of these. But in my mind, we've crossed that. We don't need to worry about hurting property values.
And I think that, a indication of that would be, and if you look at other towns, indication of that would be Nantucket. I mean, there's not a
I was
property.
gonna ask you, what do you see in other places, I mean?
It has an impact. I mean, I'd say that it just, water access and water views drive real estate prices. There's no doubt with that. But, there's some properties that have piers and docks, and there's others that don't. You're not allowed to, no private ownership, private property is allowed to construct a private pier, dock, or float in any of Nantucket's harbor, both harbors.
Why?
For a variety of reasons, ecological, fisheries, public access. They say that the fisheries, the scalp, so their shell fishery is scallops. People typically scallop recreationally by putting waders on, walking and pushing a rake. And so if you're adding piers, then you're basically obstructing someone from the potential of pushing a rake and collecting scallops. There's a vast mooring field but it's the protection is also ecological, where, you know, you look at Camden Harbor, it's a harbor within harbors. It's a much more significant body of water than Camden Harbor is. But it hasn't impacted real estate values. If you're waterfront and not able to,
I was gonna say, we don't have that problem.
We don't have a problem.
you know, you're getting a launch out to your boat, you're keeping it on a mooring, you know, that's the way that you access Nantucket Harbor, that's the way you should access Camden Harbor. And so I like the idea of it being able to grant that person with the property owner, there's a long mooring wait list, so if they have a riparian right to have a mooring, which that's a very meaningful right, like a very valuable right to have a mooring. And so to give them an extra one, I think, you know, we should consider that, you know, do we need to know, you know,
No.
they get one.
Yeah.
But
They give a waiting list like.
it's one of those towns that I think we should look to, and Barb sent their action plan, which has a lot of information on reasons why, and which go a lot more in detail.
We need
But
it.
they hired an outside consultant to look at this, to advise people like us who may or may not be educated in this space, but are coming at it from a, you know.
That's a
and
good point.
and and I think it's a quite lengthy, it's a meaningful decision, right? Like, it's what makes the fabric of Camden is our coastline. And so, I mean, to Barb's point on public access and private, you know, I think that, and Rebecca had a list of questions that were so helpful.
Thank you.
And one of them is, are the locations of one or more public piers could be placed to provide access to not just the 4 or 5 private landowners who are under current ordinances who build a pier, but to the public at large. And I thought about that, I said, well, one of them's at Lake Beach. So would we as a town build one at Lake Beach? A pier? I don't think we would, but for environmental reasons. You know,
You're saying no for this reason, so you don't want to go and do it.
Well, there's
I would do
another one that could be built there.
You
because I think
could
it's
build
the
one in
benefit, the benefit to put it, okay, water access, well, we have a kayak out there, you can pull your dinghy down, we could make that ramp a little bit more accessible, yes, to get your dinghy up and up, you know.
And we do have the public land.
But we have the public landing, so I'm not any of that, but so I don't think we would, right? We have access, we don't want to harm the environment, we have some float out there right now.
See, they didn't even identify,
There's lake,
where's, what's that road?
I actually can tell you what all the roads are.
Not Belmont, but, Beacon. Where's Beacon Avenue on this?
bottom,
Right at the end of Bayview.
yeah, down there. Beacon's near the overlook, so it's,
Where did they put?
Beacon's right on the curve.
Where?
No,
am I?
At the bottom of the map.
Beacon Avenue is on the curve, so you have the curve's overlook, so probably it's where that red,
The red
right
kind
there.
of almost cross there at the very end.
Oh, that's the coastal river, or,
That's the coastal harbor where that's the outer harbors right there. That's the transition. So
She's saying that we want a coastal harbor there.
where's Beacon Avenue? I'm so
I think
confused.
it's right where your mouse is, kind of, a little bit down, I think. Cause that's Dillingham Point where your
Yeah.
mouse is. I think,
Mhm.
And there is a pier there, right?
yes. there's
Or
one
maybe
on the
they
inside.
are. Where's Lake Beach?
Lake Beach.
Lake Beach is
Right,
right,
right
so
where your
the
mouse is.
yellow, that's it. That
Right
is
there.
a potential pier site right there, that yellow. The other one is, well, you probably know whose property that is. And then, so because it'd be off of
Metcalf.
Metcalf.
I was just
So
saying,
that one actually
Something like
comes off of, that one,
I don't know whose property that is.
but the yellow one,
Yeah,
I think that property would actually come off in front of the one that's in front of Smith and
Smith,
North.
oh, you think it's off of, okay,
Which-
Dillingham Point. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't know the property, that particular property owner's name, but I know David's, yeah, so I think that comes off of. I didn't do
I thought it was
the
the-
analysis where Will Gartley
I thought it was right around the corner. I thought it was the
But-
last one on Metcalf. That's all.
could be. We'd have to ask Will.
Yeah, might
We
not be.
haven't even. I have no idea where. I'm just kind of guessing. But I thought it was.
I think it's hard, so, I mean, I don't know if this is accurate enough, but I think it's sometimes hard for people that have all of these
Beacon out here.
interests in something like this. You know, be able to look at it from a different perspective. You know,
Yes, which is why I think having a consultant would be.
What do you mean?
I mean-
With the harbor committee.
Well, I'll say, I'm not sure what you're
I mean,
getting
Kind
at,
of a bias or,
I know, I just think sometimes it's hard to be able to look beyond, you know, the things that you're really familiar with. When you're making these kind of decisions, and then when you have somebody that has no ties to a community or something like that come in, they can come in and say, these are really the things when we look at a place, these are the things we really need to look at. I mean, because it's hard even for me, like because when I get ingrained into something, I can't step outside of it. I need sometimes having a different perspective. At least lets you think about it. Doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're wrong.
Yeah, I think I think ultimately, density, habitat, climate change and public access are the overarching topics when you're dealing with any type of construction or shifts or change, on the landscape. However, yes, the Harbor Committee has a particular interest, and that's what they're there to voice.
They're
They're
there
to
for that
voice that
reason.
particular-
But
We
sometimes
have a
you-
particular interest sitting on the Conservation Commission, and hopefully we can address those things, I laugh, but it's true, we speak for the trees and the bees and the, and the fish and the things that don't have the human voice, right? Like, that's what we're here for.
But it's good for someone else, even
But
for our
somebody
perspective,
else
to come in and say, hey, like the person for, erosion and sediment control, he can come in and say, hey, these are the things that we look at.
Yeah.
Here's where you are in relation to other.
He would still be
places.
more biased in his own town than he would be, in ours.
Sure, but sometimes I guess that's just.
I guess, yeah, it'd be
I
interesting.
think what
to
you're
see-
saying is kind of,
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to even get like opinion on, okay, so our harbor in a way is also maybe not as working as Rockport, but there are commercial boats in our harbor that I'm not sure if any of the traps in our harbor are commercial or not, but there's traps, especially in Sherman Cove on the northern side of the.
Yeah,
People
some
want to
are.
navigate
Oh, yeah,
going
yeah.
around.
Yep.
And so I think about public access, I guess, in the ability to have a mooring and the ability to, navigate the harbor. Should I want to put a trap? I have a non-commercial recreational license, so I put traps in the harbor and I want to be able to navigate through that. And so I don't know the science or like the thought, but like if we put those piers in, does that take away, obviously it takes away navigation. Does it take away pier? Like if I'm on a town resident looking to get a mooring, so now there's 5 less mooring spots because there's a pier there, that hurts public access. So I guess I'm trying to think about it. Am I thinking about it the right way?
Yes, when there are, each pier displaces a few moorings, and there's a
Okay.
long line for people to get moorings.
So we know.
How
that
many
the
more,
pier
do you know?
It depends on the size of the
Depends
boat, it's a changeable thing constantly, depending on the length and the depth of the boat.
But it does reduce public access because.
oh,
of
yeah,
this.
and that's one of the
absolutely.
criteria. So currently, when a pier is proposed, it goes through this process where the Harbor Committee reviews it based on a bunch of different criteria, and it's all about whether there's a substantial impact or not a substantial impact. And different harbor committees over time have evaluated that differently. There was a period in time where the Harbor Committee was known for, considering everything a substantial impact, and nobody was able to build piers because the Harbor Committee said, oh yeah, no, that would be a substantial impact, that would be a substantial impact. Now we have swung the opposite direction. And so one of the things that we talked about at the select board level, because we then go through the same list of things and have to make an official finding of fact based on what's in evidence that there is or is not a substantial impact in any of these areas. And one of them is, substantial displacement of moorings or potential moorings. And my opinion is that one mooring is a substantial impact, because especially when you consider sea level rise and the fact that whether or not there's it's possible to have or desirable to have a mooring in a certain area is based on the depth of the water.
Yeah.
And as that increases, more and more potential mooring spots open up. The other thing is that I was opposed to the pier at Harbor Road because of there are potential mooring spots, not for big boats, but for smaller boats. And the demand for those spaces, I would argue, has not been very high because the town has done such a poor job of maintaining and making available as public access points. So as soon as you make, so Marine Avenue, for years and years, nobody really knew about a Harbor Road. We haven't done anything, but as soon as people can have a kayak or they can access that area more easily, those mooring spots then, in my opinion, become, potentially more desirable also. So looking, at the future, you can say, oh yeah, there's not a lot of demand. Right now, there's not a lot of demand for certain mooring spots, but they could easily become.
Really? I mean, I'm on the 2 mooring list wait list, or I was on my 17-foot, I think I'm still number like 80 something, like 40 or 8, I've been on for years, so I
You
would,
can't get a mooring?
for a small boat, the
Really?
wait list is probably, I mean, I don't
And
know,
for the outer harbor,
for a larger boat, I think it's probably, still probably, it's been a year. And I think we're at number 3 for a 35-foot boat, but for a 17-foot boat, the list is where it's drafts much less.
well, maybe you should go and take a look at some of these areas where there aren't moorings already, and you could say, you know what, I've evaluated this, and I think this might be an appropriate spot for a mooring.
I'm fine, totally fine waiting for a mooring. I don't want to over, and I think the mooring field is quite large right now. And so when I think about density, I think about there's a wait list of people coming, public people, I think about access. So it's hard, I'm trying to stay somewhere aligned, but like density, have to access, they do kind of. Like,
Absolutely, they
um,
overlap certainly.
Yeah, but what she
So-
was saying is that there is room, but just there's not a lot of access in those locations.
Right, so because when you really
Right.
dig into it, you ask Steve to determine, because the harbor master makes a determination each time with the pier, whether it's gonna displace a mooring or not.
Is he
And it's-
using a ranking criteria or is he using a subjective site evaluation thing? And I don't miss, there's no, I'm just asking a question. It's not a
think
judgment,
it's
it's
just a
just a,
Me too.
I don't know that, but I think.
He has
So-
when I listened to one of the harbor committee meetings, there's a different, I guess, there's a different rule that I think a harbor master, harbor master has, that he has like the ability to place a mooring where he wants, where I think I don't know, someone like a landowner might have had to go through DEP, or I don't know what it exactly was, but I think harbor master has some ability.
The way it usually works is in the harbor master zone, you have to go through to put a mooring out anywhere in the harbor.
I think so.
That's,
Oh, you can't just put your own.
no, you
I
gotta
think
have,
he has discretion of like where he can.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't need to go to like
No.
DEP,
Right.
harbor master,
harbor
he's,
master can set more.
yeah, so
okay.
I think he's using it subjective, like.
Right, so I want to keep this moving, it's
Yeah.
not, because it's all good discussion and it's just like a lot of inputs, and of course, things are gonna overlap naturally, so I want to kind of circle back and say that, one suggestion, and this is, we'll determine, we will send out a draft of a letter or recommend, our thoughts, going forward, but just one thing that came up was, rather than more peers, provide the possibility is there of providing those shoreline owners with a mooring. A mooring,
So I guess,
a mooring, in place of, or, the pier.
But I
As
think
a
possibly be voted upon by the town since it's already a waiting list.
yeah, it does, it really.
Oh, sure, I think this is gonna have to go.
Yeah.
through the
Yeah,
town,
no,
But
totally.
that's a possible.
I just thought it was a possible option, I mean, it honestly negatively impacts public access, because you're adding more into the field, and field is only so much, right? But I guess I'm trying to think of it as the compromise. to
Yeah,
say
no, I
well,
think
so-
I think it's reasonable. I'm gonna
Okay.
make sure. Then there's some discussion of a third party, expert, outside opinion, and I'm gonna add town, non-stakeholder. Thank you. That's the better word, because I like stakeholder. And which I put on every category, by the way, as having third-party inspection, but
It would be good to know what is a high density level versus a low density
for
level.
our
Or,
particular,
yeah, for the situation, because I mean, how do you know that? I don't know that.
Yeah,
Maybe they know that.
I think we acknowledge that density is subjective, but there are measurable points
Yeah.
for fisheries. There's measurable points for overall shoreline versus existing density versus to measure for sediment erosion control. There are measurable things within density that can be used. So, yes, aesthetic is always going to be kind of, but there are measurables. To consideration of shoreline for modified shorelines, further modifying the shorelines in terms of stabilization, force of waves, weather.
A good example of that, just to give everybody a perspective on Harbor Road, they went and armored the whole area and put a big pier up there, a dock. And
They're
adjacent,
working on it, yeah.
It's in process.
adjacent to that is the town's property.
Yep, I was just there.
So the town's property is already like having erosion problems.
Yes.
But now that they've armored all of that, it's only gonna be 100 times worse. So not only have they kind of made an area more better for them, but they've worsened it for the public. Because now the public point is gonna degrade more quickly, and that's the only access point, and there's no other way to get down there.
Right, which is why many places have put a moratorium on all shoreline armoring, is the term that gets used.
Right.
So, I mean, that was a little too, I tried to include that in this moratorium to begin with, but I mean, that's the major like environmental part and the climate change adaptation part of that. I
Yeah,
mean, it's one
because-
of the major things.
Yeah, because
I think what's challenging about that too is that, so that probably went through all the right, it's
Yes,
DEP, all that kind of stuff,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
yep,
All zoning, all the things.
nobody did anything wrong.
And I think what's interesting is that what we're seeing is that these environmental based decisions that are being put in place by the state and federal don't take into account specific habitats. And we, as a conservation commission at a town level, need to take those regulations and then apply them or add to them to make it specific to our habitat. Because
yeah,
clearly.
well, it's also a set of minimum standards and
Minimum.
what happened, so it's minimum standard, this is just what basically has to be done, and it doesn't take doesn't take into consideration the amount of slope, and it uses the same best practices in a very basic way. And we have over the last 20-30 years shifted very heavily for any number of reasons that we don't have time for to armoring rather than vegetating.
Yeah.
So, which from a climate change impact and standpoint, not just in your own personal aesthetics aside, but from a climate change standpoint and from a long-term really habitat slope, so on and so forth, vegetation wins every time. Vegetation is going to win on all, for habitat, for climate sustainability, for slope, for all the, all the nuances.
And I don't think, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, it doesn't seem like when they give a permit to do that, they're looking at what kind of impact does it have on the adjacent property? You know what I mean? And this so happens to be, the adjacent properties is the town property.
Absolutely.
So in my opinion, if you go and do that, whether you did it right or wrong, if what you did causes impact on public property, you should be kind of.
Or
responsible
anyone
for it.
else's
Or anybody's property, sure, but even in this case, it's everybody's property.
Absolutely.
It's not
There
just
should be a
one person.
violation. I mean, I was thinking it should be
Well, it's-
somewhat
Well,
It should be, you should have a responsibility that if
so
you,
compared to the existing condition.
right, if you just impacted, because what's gonna happen in that's a nice access point right now. I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know what's gonna happen, but if armoring all that is now gonna degrade that point of access to the water for the public, that's probably not really the right thing,
And they did it for the construction of the pier.
well,
Right,
yes,
And no one did anything wrong, I will repeat that, I just think that they need to look at things a little bit more globally, you know what I mean? It can't just be my piece of property, it has to look
Well,
at.
it's a great kind of small case study, if you will.
Exactly.
For the conversation around density and environmental impact, and, so it's, it's a great example.
I can guarantee you that if you start taking photos of that now, you're gonna see that probably degrade pretty quickly at this point, because it's all been armored right there, just because it's just what's gonna happen.
And so the last point I wanted to make that really could be tied in, as going forward with, with the
Yes.
other categories is, can there be a ranking criteria? Can we establish for the, well, we can theoretically, yes, we can, but should there be a ranking criteria on moorings, fisheries, navigation, scenic views, density? For both the harbor master and for the review of any potential shift, within the outer or coastal
Harbor.
whether it was a pier really or sort of anything impacting the harbor, but it's unusual to not have
I mean, like a qualification.
a ranking criteria. So I serve on a lands committee for a regional land trust, not to be, and this happens on others, but there is a ranking criteria for land for property evaluation as to whether or not it is, the right property to go into conservation, or if it ranks higher than another one being evaluated. And it's the same ranking criteria. There's a whole bunch of things, and it's, to determine, and it's a real evaluative tool, it's a measure to say, is this the right thing or not?
So they follow when they do their.
Well, I mean, we do know there is that whole thing that's, that we go through that I think you could say it's a rank, it's a, right, but,
Clearly it's.
I mean,
It's
just
easy.
to,
Maybe
so
even,
No.
if you look at
yeah,
how they came to the plan, back in 2015, the planning board and the harbor committee unanimously recommended to prohibit new private piers in the outer harbor. So,
This was just in 2015.
2015, yes. So
That was the harbor.
the
committee?
harbor committee and the planning board, do you know how hard it is to come up with at that time, especially for them
And
to,
the planning
and the
board?
planning
Oh,
board.
no, I put rope select board, it's not that, it's planning board, I'm sorry.
in the select board, so the proposal was to put, so here's, one of the articles here, I can send these to everybody, but the select board voted 3-2 not to put that out to voters.
Wow.
So in terms of like looking at,
geez.
I don't think we need to see ourselves as sort of like the radical environmentalists that are trying to intervene in
No,
property.
No,
Right.
it's-
It was that wasn't even the Conservation Commission at the time. So, and the reasons that they gave for it were so the harbor committee has proposed several amendments regarding piers, including prohibiting new piers in the outer harbor, eliminating provisions for consolidated piers, and clarify. They got rid of the consolidated piers part, which is where people could share piers, because it was essentially, they found it to be too complicated and there were like fights. But really, that was a better solution, I think, than having everybody has to have their own pier. The harbor committee is the harbor ordinance is amended, the planning board has proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance, blah, blah, blah. Gene McKeever, chairman of the harbor committee, Gene McKeever, said August 4th that in doing its work on the amendments, they focused on what was going to be for the good of the entire population, not just a select few private waterfront property owners. He also said that the committee didn't think that a bunch of private piers sticking out into our harbor was good for the general public. Let's look at it a little bit different way, said McKeever. When people first started coming to Camden, do you think they came in and said, wow, this is a really pretty harbor. It would look much prettier with a bunch of piers sticking out into it. That's the sort of logic that we've been using. We are looking for the good of the entire population of the state of Maine and those from foreign countries that get to look at our harbor. So, I mean, for a lot of people, there's just this aesthetic
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm one of them.
aspect of it too. And so I guess it's really troubling to me to see the huge swing in the way this is being viewed from, the Harbor Committee. And it feels like we've lost some of the history. The only reason this didn't go to voters is because one select board member at the time, that was the,
Well, I think what was troubling at the Harbor Committee is, and maybe it's not troubling, maybe it's just an education that you're only kind of thinking about the purview that you see in front of you. And so, the Harbor Committee is doing their job of working with the ordinance that's in front of them. And so I think there's some continued learning, understanding of the Harbor Committee of what the current ordinance even is. As I was listening to the meetings, there was conversation on the depth of 6 feet, and should someone's property, drop to, immediately drop to 20 feet, does that mean that they can't have one? But there was a misunderstanding there. Are we taking deep water access away, thinking that we could be having more locations? And so it is troubling hearing, I think, from an environmental or just from a Camden citizens perspective, thinking about a holistic perspective, think about more. But I'm hoping there's just an education component at the Harbor Committee so that they can see a broader lens, rather than kind of suggesting we should be raising piers, additional 2 feet, or we should be looking at depth and waterfront in a different way, or length of pier in a different way. We should really be thinking about it in a much broader forest perspective of what does it mean to have ecologically or environmentally or navigation wise a pier that drops 20 feet, what does it mean? And I think once we learn that, we're going to find that we don't have the space, nor is it a benefit to the world we live in to construct these piers. And so I'm wondering if we go back to the committee, Harbor Committee, the specific changes to the document, or if we go back just
Do we
saying,
quorum?
like, this is rather than saying, because I feel like we could do a temporary solution. Oh, we should be raising piers another 2 feet. Well, in 50 years, we're gonna have to raise it again, so how do we, I guess I pose a question, how should we best go back to our role of the Harbor Committee, the select board, to articulate all these things?
Yeah, well, I would say for us that, upon review of the Harbor Committee's recommendations, the Conservation Commission would like to submit a number of responses and suggestions under the following categories, and I would use density and habitat, and so, and frame them as such, or do overall XYZ, you could raise the question, is it to the public benefit to have 4 additional piers, to the public, ecological and or human, but we are a part of, we forget we're part of the ecology, but here we are. So is that, you can have these overarching questions, these fit in all categories or some to be raised, and then have these specific points that can be addressed or raised or questions to consider. That's what we're here. We can advise, we can educate, we can, reach out and see what sticks, so to speak. We're not an enforcement agency by any stretch. So I think we just have to be
So you're thinking like,
really mindful and respond specifically to this document. And I would like to get, even if it means we'll have to pass it back and forth and edit a document in the next week, because I need to get it to him, to Josh, and give it to the other chair by next Wednesday, because we meet January 11th. So he'll need time to, he'll want to ponder it,
So we'll
I'll be there to discuss in person on the 11th with them.
would it be fair to say that we're basically writing based on conversations that a draft, or we'll draft in the next week or so on these 4 categories: density, what it means for piers, putting some numbers, objective numbers that we can, to moorings, to what's in there today, navigation.
Yeah, well, I'm not comfortable professionally or person putting
Doing that.
numbers on it
Okay.
unless there
So the
is,
subjective stuff.
you know, if it's NOAA, DEP, if we have like some tangible numbers based on, you know, some research, you know, I'm okay with inserting that and making references to, but we certainly don't have time in the next 2 weeks to get any tangible numbers on this specific harbor.
Can I ask the process thing? So
Yeah.
if the select board asked the harbor committee to, what were they initially asked to do with this? Come up with a policy?
Recommendation.
Recommendations?
Yeah, so we have, we have the moratorium in place, and the idea would be that the expiration of the moratorium corresponds with updates to the ordinance to address the concerns raised in the moratorium. So yeah, they're supposed to come up with recommendations for ordinance changes if needed.
But they don't, but it seems like their ordinance changes do not address any of the concerns that people had when the moratorium was put in place. It's sort of just the opposite.
They're basically
way I'm
saying
reading it.
there actually isn't a concern for the most part, but maybe they could be raised.
Yeah.
And why do
that
you think
was
people voted to so heavily to have a your moratorium if they didn't think there was any concerns?
I think
I think
that's-
that this is a perfect opportunity to put it out to voters and to ask voters if they want to prohibit new private piers in the coastal. It could be two separate questions, the coastal harbor and the outer harbor. And if people say yes, then that's that. If people say no, that they don't want to ban them, that's when we would work harder at coming up with criteria. So to me, this is, shared scenic, recreational, environmental resources that the public in general has a right to say
Absolutely.
what direction we want to go in. And that the only thing I was trying to from our perspective too, are there any conservation related benefits that we can think of for private piers?
None,
No,
none.
No, there's.
Just the opposite.
I haven't thought of any yet, but maybe, because that's what we're supposed to be doing for the most part, is recommending what we think
I just
is.
don't think it's the way that I think, and I appreciate the question. I think it's a really healthy question, but I think that, but I do think that the appropriate, even with people with piers today, I do still feel that the appropriate way to access our harbor is by, a mooring field, by having, not having, because most of the people that have piers, structures have a float, then they have their mooring, or they still have their boat on a mooring. Like,
Some of them have the boat.
some of them do, but like, if you look at, the larger boats, so, you look at the Watsons, they have some that they keep there, and they have their larger boat that they keep on their mooring, and they still go out to their mooring, they access their boat by their mooring. So I still think that from even if it were a town owned or private owned, I think that there's challenge. I think it'd be challenging to find a conservation benefit to a structure in water.
So sometimes what they do is in places where like a lot of dredging has happened, or there's kind of the biological diversity has been all, extracted or whatever. There are certain types of structures that are put in, specifically for a habitat benefit. So I'm not saying
So I
that
guess,
necessarily I would want to task private property owners with like, okay, we're gonna encourage more private piers because then the juvenile salmon have somewhere to hide, but maybe there is also room here. We do have existing piers. And one of the questions that we should probably consider is like adaptation of those piers in terms of raising them. So we just had one fall down too. So I don't know what happens in that case. But maybe it does start to get pretty dicey to take rights away from people. Are we gonna tell people they have to just let their pier be submerged, or are we gonna give them an upper? That is probably detrimental to everybody. If they want to raise it, maybe there's, criteria that, there's the light penetrating, structures are generally better than there's, I would say that, there's a concern with the type of material that it's made from. If a pier is going to fall off, we probably want it to all fall apart in one piece and just sink to the bottom rather than splintering apart. Or lighting is another concern that I have. The proliferation of just so much light in the harbor, and putting lighting on the piers is like a safety thing sometimes, but it's also it can be really, it's just not, and then is there a safety concern too with all of the stuff on the piers if they get washed away? So like the type of material, I don't know if we weigh in at all anywhere in the ordinance on the type of materials that are.
Well, it certainly wasn't addressed.
So like looking at adaptation, we're probably not going to tell people they have to remove their existing piers. So maybe there's something that we should.
But I don't think at this point in time, you have to worry
I
about
think we gotta
people
be,
making their piers taller.
But we do have right now, we're going to have like one just fell down. So those.
no, we have to
presumably
address it
don't wanna-
because we definitely need to discuss the overarching thing that was addressed in all of the recommendations, or like the sort of final recommendation was, the first thing is in the outer, should we raise the height limit from 6 feet to 8 feet? And my comments as I, went through all of this, was that doesn't actually accommodate the calculated increase. The calculated increase at the beginning of the document specifically states is that climate change is expected to raise the sea level in this area to a height of 4 feet or higher over, and so why would we half do the job? Like, why would, again, whether we want them higher or not, the climate's going to raise and the existing piers are there. So why would we encourage anybody to spend that much time and money and do it halfway?
Right.
Do it
2
right,
feet is just not-
because it's an impact, even just working in and around the community, whether you're navigating a boat or whether you're sitting there listening to all the like banging and clanging in the machines or whatever to do the job, like just do it right and do it the first time for at least the next projected 100+ years, right? Don't raise it 2 feet and then 50 years from now be like, oh, well, most of us are dead and gone and, now it's somebody else's problem. Like, just do it right the first time and we're not going to
That's a
take
great
it away. Woo!
So
Wow.
so the people whose dock fell down, do you think they're entitled to rebuild it now?
I don't know.
I don't think that's true.
I don't know if they'll have to go through if that's going to be consired a repair or, but 2 feet is just.
It sure is.
And they look at, mean high tide, so 6 feet above mean high water. Mean high water isn't even like, that's just not enough, because what you need is like, are we just going to be preparing for the, like, oh, all of these piers are going to be just fine on the average day in Camden Harbor in 2012 or whenever they base that like tidal data off of. But you get a little bit of storm surge, and this is what we have now. That's just dangerous when I just, anyway, so 2 feet, I think that they're higher the better personally. But I know that when I talked to some of the other harbor committee members from the last time, they made the recommendation to not have any of this. And it was aesthetic. The limitations in the past have been aesthetic. So they felt that there's less of an impact on the aesthetics. So people seem to be in general agreement that these things look terrible. And that if you can make them lower, they don't look as bad.
So if climate change
People
overtakes
don't,
the docks,
who wants these things? So few people.
if they become unusable because of climate change, is that something we really have to worry about?
No.
I mean, that's not our problem. They built it. It's private property. They took it. It's basically property. They made private property over public property. And now we have to, what's our concern because they're
Because it
private
was
properties.
attached, I guess.
What?
Because it was, because they don't, 'cause it- I don't know, you're right.
So they lose the dog.
Yeah.
One goes a pier. One must be.
I don't want to go
No,
down.
I'm not gonna move anything over it.
I mean, typically.
That's my personal opinion also, but what I find sometimes is that doesn't.
But that's not what's reflected in.
Right,
That's gonna be-
property owners in Maine own to the low water mark, unfortunately.
At the moment, but that's up for debate again.
I hope so, and
It is being challenged again,
I get, okay.
because most places it's total opposite.
I know, it's just very, very upsetting, and I don't know why we haven't made more progress.
So like the town, I guess, because we're, for the existing piers that, let's say, I mean, town really are floats, right? Like, I mean, town piers.
We're talking about private piers.
Okay, so for private piers, let's say, let's say we have an existing private pier. That's. You know, I guess when you look at it, 6 feet, so is it 6 feet, like? So is it, there's. 6 foot depth, is that what they're, or where's the, and then,
They take the mean high water mark, whatever that's
okay,
determined to be, so the average high water at high tide, which is probably around 10 feet or something. And then they add 6 feet to
so
that,
you've got to be above,
but it's not, that doesn't incorporate any kind of storm surge.
okay, so we're 6 feet above. And then we're saying it's been reported by some top that we're seeing a 4 feet water. We should be expecting a 4 feet sea level rise or when,
So the Maine Climate
okay,
Council, or whatever, says that we should be preparing for 2 feet, I think, and the possibility of 4 feet. But if you look at 2 feet from where we are now, it's not right. Where we are now is with the piers is already a problem. Right. I
so
was,
bringing up 2 feet, so then if we bring it up 4, I'm just thinking, so then you're basically, so this. For someone who has their boat tied right up to their dock. That may become an issue, I guess, for their accessibility to their boat.
Yeah, but they usually have a float.
But typically, I think most of them right have a ramp and then a
Yeah.
float.
Right,
So that's not an issue. It's just the walking structure
right.
that we're raising.
Yeah, the fixed structure.
Just the fixture, and that's typically not where they're tying. But I guess in the case of tying up, maybe there is it. Okay. I just,
Just trying to visualize.
I mean, it's not uncommon to see those gangways much higher than the high water.
Well, and they'll stand the they'll stand the test of time.
Right, and then you
And
have a gang.
again, if you're going, if it's there, if it's gonna be repaired, if it's gonna be built under current, like. Barring anyone's, personal, like, let's be conscientious of as many ecological footprints and as well as the aesthetic and the noise and light and all the pollutions and, the impacts, and let's just, if you're gonna do it right and do it well, do it for the longest term possible.
Just do it for the current conditions
Do it.
or the future.
For,
conditions.
Yeah. At this point, we're projected at 4 feet higher, so at least go 4 feet higher.
Right.
Will it eventually get toppled over on occasional storms? Sure, of course, but will it,
Oh, it'd be a lot less staff to have.
well, certainly for the next 50 odd years, right? So,
It's the lights too, that's a big one, because the lights shouldn't be casting beyond. It should be like a zero.
just a little footprint, the literal footprints, yeah. So we obviously have gone a little beyond our allotted time, and that's totally fine, and we can keep right on track with this. I just want to know if we can focus or make any specific comments on habitat, public access, or if we kind of overlapped a lot of our discussion. I want to make
I
sure.
mean, I feel like
that.
habitat would be to understand the species that are in our harbor and what they need and what they're, I know that's, you know, like you said, it's a number that neither one of us have done the research to present in this, at this time. But I think it would be, that's how at least I'm thinking habitat or what, what's the ecology and what's the wildlife, marine life.
Does get impacted when, you know, a pier is built. You know, kind of what happens to wildlife habitat?
I guess we're
When it
thinking
appears-
shoreline too, because there's, you know, there's obviously tidal, there's marine life that lives in tidal zones, so if we're impacting, we're creating an armory. I imagine that'd be a reduction of habitat.
Right, and then, you know, another thing is just the actual process of building the
Right.
pier. You know, it's
Right.
very disruptive. I mean, sometimes it's not as disruptive. I would say that the ones that are just pinned to ledge and it's doesn't do as much. Sometimes you'll see a lot of, depending on the way things are constructed, it'll become like a place that fish gravitate to. But yeah, there's then the other thing would be just additional human activity
Yeah,
all the time.
Right. Or boats.
With and lights. Then there's eelgrass is something in Sherman's Cove.
we did those with scouts, the eelgrass is really important.
And that grass is very, is like, I know that a lot of that marsh grass and that eelgrass is like being slowly weeded out, so to speak, just because of activity and development along the shoreline.
Yeah, you lose eelgrass, you lose a lot of
Right.
habitat.
I mean, I don't know this specific situation, but I know that that's a problem. Be good to know, you know, what kind of health the harbor has and what things are, probably subjected to
Yeah.
decline or already.
Yeah. All right, then on, so one of the things that was recommended is, outer coastal harbors obtain a permit either from the town or from Army Corps of Engineers, therefore, and therefore require a harbor committee and planning board review as it relates to habitat prior to select board approval or denial. I would say that it shouldn't be an either or. I think that there should be one NERPA and Army Corps, any of the shoreline requires permitting, that's a given. But it should be and rather than or, and particularly with regard to habitat, which is something that falls well within conservation. Is that we on the Conservation Commission could suggest that I mean, they've been very courteous and are allowing us to review at this point anyway, but even just to say that Conservation Commission would have the opportunity to review habitat, so that rather than not just, I mean, it's planning board, I mean, that all boards have the opportunity to weigh in and that we could just
That'd be awesome.
respectfully request that we be added.
I was gonna ask.
So to select that way, the select board receive the Conservation Commission's recommendation.
That's well
It could just be going to the harbor committee and the Conservation Commission for review of the same criteria.
Yeah, and because we're looking
to
at it
give a
from two
different
different angles, and that's
Right.
totally fine, that's exactly what
Right.
I mean.
I mean, what
Look at
purview
this.
does the Conservation Commission have in these affairs? I mean,
Well,
do they,
Advisory, just like harbor, we don't
Yeah.
have any regulatory.
well, I mean, over the, like, because sometimes, committees can get upset if another committee is,
Well, so far, so good.
I was curious, I'm asking a question, I mean, is it a welcome thing or is it a?
I think it depends on the dynamic. I mean, I'm certainly, I reached out to Josh and he was happy to have me at the meeting and was happy to hear what we had to say and vice versa. I mean, it's all, they can take it or leave it on as, I guess.
Does the Conservation Commission have anywhere in the policy or ordinance, any kind of like,
No, not as it pertains to peers, but the role of the Conservation Commission is to advise the town
On
on,
environmental and
At large.
conservation issues.
right.
Related to
what-
So I think a change to the ordinance might be to, if we're not gonna prohibit altogether, I think that. Not to be so blunt, I think it would be nice to be included in the recommendation part of that review.
Yeah.
With historic, so that we could, and then, because, as I understand it, and that process, when I was listening to the work group, that process seems like it might be changing of how peers are, if not prohibited, how they get approved. It seems like there's some miscommunication or understanding of ordinance, so that whole ordinance might be changed, so maybe our request would be that we as conservation get the chance to recommend to the select board or.
So with public access, my comments are basically what we just recently discussed, because towards the end of that section, it says the committee noted that the existing pier height limit of 6 feet actually hinders navigation at high tide and is, there is no room under the pier to paddle or even kayak a small boat. Again, based on the climate change predictions of 4-foot sea level rise, if there's going to be a recommendation to existing and or future piers as things lie, that it would be my recommendation to not do it halfway, but to do it the whole way. If we're going to have to make an adjustment, do it once. Well, at least for the next 100 years.
So does it say there, I missed
So-
that, does it seem that they're saying that somebody should be able to kayak underneath them at all?
The
Tides,
impact,
is
it's
that what they're-
implied.
I don't think
not-
we should also be looking, obviously kayak, but it's also like public access through boats, so like you're taking away moorings, you're taking away trap locations, you're taking away.
Navigability.
Navigability, I can go 6 feet.
Yeah,
I can go
like we're
6
really
feet.
far away from being able to kayak underneath there right now.
And then, but it's more than just kayak,
Just like-
You're thinking,
Yeah.
wow, this is like a kayak, like a kayak,
And
like-
not all people want to kayak under piers despite their
Right.
addendum there. I mean, that's kind of,
Yeah, you avoid.
I'm a kayaker and I really
I go
don't enjoy it.
around, yeah, I go around, but
I don't enjoy having to go around at all. It's a pain in the neck when you have to go out in the middle of the channel.
No,
with
no, it
9
was-
It's
There
like,
was an addendum in the Harvard thing that said, there was somebody wrote a letter saying that he leads kayak tours and people enjoy kayaking under piers. It's a big thrill.
Well, you can't paddleboard under here.
And I just say that's.
I
that's
I don't know where that, if they enjoy kayaking under them, then something has to change because it's not possible.
Well, no, that's why there should be more piers because it's more fun for people to kayak.
That's what they're saying?
Yeah.
that was a letter.
I saw that.
Sent to
I didn't read that. I started reading that and was like,
It's
all
fun
right.
for people to have piers to kayak under. And I just
We
think that's what
build
someone's
piers
first,
to
yeah,
kayak under
for the
pier.
kayakers, which is that's just a random. And I think,
It's like I prefer going in a subway rather than.
But it's not possible to kayak under them.
I know. but-
I know,
but
I know that's like a side thing, but that's like a main thing is like, it's rarely possible to
Low tide.
kayak.
Most
underneath
people
them.
don't get kayaks, so they can get to go kayaking under piers. I mean,
Right.
you kayak because you want to be out of the water. So
You
that,
wanna
that
kayak-
first letter should just
People
be,
like to be able to go along the shoreline and look at the fish and things like that.
Right, you don't want to kayak in the middle of the mooring boats, you've got boats coming in and out of the mooring boat, if you're kayaking, you want to go.
Or in the channel.
Yeah, you want
Yeah.
to stay close to ship.
It's safer, it's you.
I mean, that. I
It's
It's
don't
more
know.
interesting because you can see it's,
Yeah, boaters don't want to have people in, in kayakers, that kind of thing, and obviously kayak has right away over, but. You want to
So,
say,
yeah, sort of.
you want to say,
yeah, I mean,
so yes, I think public, sorry, you're saying public.
yeah, so we're talking about public, yeah, so let's keep it tight, but.
oh, the public access thing also is that sometimes the piers are used as so the public has the right to access the intertidal zone for the purposes of fishing, fouling, and navigation, based on that, like British treaty from the 1200s or anything. So sometimes though, the piers really are like used as a way of obstructing that, or people will put private property signs on them. And so when people are in doubt about whether, so say you just want to park at Marine Ave and walk to the navigate, so to speak, maybe to the other town access point at Harbor Road. And you have a pier in the middle and it says, has a private property sign on it. That has a chilling effect, even if somebody is out there with their fishing net and they're, there to fish or do whatever. I would say that public access is like, that's an impact there.
Well, it's also like, if you have a pier there, he's fishing, she's fishing, well, can't fish near a pier, you don't want to fish, I mean, maybe for the structure, it's fishing in there, but your line's gonna get caught, you don't want to be
Right.
a public access point to swim or to do that,
So the only other thing I wanted to note under public access comments is there are so few piers on the coastal harbor that public access does not seem to be affected at all. And my response or thought there was that that may be true now, but we need to look ahead and be proactive and not reactive.
Mhm.
What is sort of the norm or what the land use or property owners approach now to not, or choice now to not have a pier or to not impact particularly the northern, but really any of our Camden's coastal shoreline to date. We've got 3 piers on the coastal shoreline. They're all south. They're not north, but they're all south. But doesn't mean that if we don't have some moratorium or changes or, it doesn't mean that there can't be in the future. And I think that we would be remiss to think that is like it hasn't happened, so it's never going to.
Well, I think on access, the way that they're suggesting, it seems like it's only access from the shoreline, like, oh, you can access through Lake Beach, or you can access through town dock, so you can access. No, we're talking about access, public access
Overall.
in the water. like,
Yeah.
Right.
while you're in the
Right.
water.
That's
You know what I mean?
that's what I'm saying. It doesn't mean just because there aren't any north of Sherman's Cove now, doesn't mean there won't be in the future, and what that does or doesn't do, but to just say that it's not really, it's a concern.
Is there inevitably, unless they stop all piers.
Something's gonna happen, something's gonna
Right,
change.
so let's say it does, let's say, you're only successful in limiting a certain amount of this building piers. Shouldn't there be something in place that says if you do build a pier, you need to contribute a certain amount to a public access point? Or improve a public access point? Because you're basically taking away more access to the public. So you should have to, they do this with
They do this.
environmental projects all the time. You have to almost in kind, put as much money into a public access point as you do the public.
That's what another way to do it would be what I was hoping we could have done with this last one, and I think maybe is that if somebody were gonna build a pier and they were also willing to give a perpetual public easement to the intertidal zone
Yeah,
there.
Yeah.
Then you'd be gaining
right, then you gain
Something
you don't lose it all.
that, okay, forever, people are gonna have access to this beach
Right.
and they're not gonna try to,
Yeah, so the question of equal exchange, so I get to 250 square feet and then whatever.
You're gonna build on
you-
Harbor Road, but you gotta
I'm
build,
gonna, pay for or access, or I'm gonna provide
Sounds
250, so. Well,
I just,
I understand
It is
the thought of it.
I was just thinking about it, there could be different changes to that, but you see that sometimes as a compromise.
Mhm.
You limit the amount of growth, but also the growth that does happen has to contribute to public access.
yeah,
Because otherwise you get nothing.
Yeah, in the public access sphere, that is brilliant, but I wonder how that fits in with density and habitat. And so
It could be as simple as you have to put money towards a fund to improve the public landing. I don't know. You know what I mean? It could be something like that. I'm not saying it has to be, but.
that's what they do with the Army Corps or the
Right.
enterprise. It goes into a pool, a funding
Exactly.
pool, and then it goes into public projects as
Right.
opposed, within an area.
You'd be surprised how quickly that would probably add up.
Yeah.
So then we've already addressed the sea level rise really because it affects every step, with, because again, it addresses the outer harbor from raising it from 6 to 8 feet. And so we've already talked about whether that's the right number of feet to consider. The final recommendation within that section is that the harbor committee also recommends that the town research what other communities are doing to address climate change and sea level rise in their ordinances and building requirements. My comment there was, is this not grounds to extend the moratorium or to put it to a town vote right there? Being that right there.
Right, and I'm going to look and see what
That's great suggestion.
what, in terms of extending the moratorium, whether we've already maxed that out or not.
It'll be a shame
But-
to make a decision based on the. I think we need,
Well, we
I
may
mean,
not
my-
have a choice.
Yeah, right.
Also, one thing that has happened since between their recommendations here and this meeting is a very significant storm that allowed us to observe, potential future impacts in a way that hadn't been possible before. So I think that that's a really,
and that's, I
we
think,
can
that's-
kind of take that tone too, that maybe they, after observing what just happened and seeing the amount of damage and the different types of things that come up, one that fell down, like that went through that whole process that they're saying, is okay.
it's not.
That
it's
maybe
not-
they would change, maybe there are some things that would change at this point.
Mhm.
I think that speaks to our
Yeah.
fourth point, climate change and sea level rise. We just experienced, like, we just had a nor'easter that. I'm trying to put words.
It was
to it,
a
but,
southeaster really, but
like, visibly showed us the effects of climate change.
So
we're
we're the
like-
fifth highest tide, they said astronomical, I heard that on the news, and I think at least in Portland was the fifth highest tide on record.
yeah, it wasn't even, and that didn't even correspond with, so it was a 12.1 foot high tide. Which isn't even the highest tide of the year.
Right.
And it wasn't even a direct hit, it came a little bit more from the east than the southeast, so it could have been even worse, but
But that's gonna change. Not only is that gonna change, and not only is that gonna impact like storm, like just a coastal flooding, but that and erosion stuff, but that's gonna ultimately, climate change goes into, it's such a broad category, because that goes into habitat, it goes into, okay, well, if salination changes, if eelgrass changes, then the populations are gonna change. And so the impact of structures in the water may be different. So climate change and sea level rise, I feel like the answer in an ordinance, like one place at a time, is gonna be really challenging, because that's such an evolving category.
right, ultimately, we don't really know exactly what the impacts are
Right.
gonna be, and, there has been talk about some kind of breakwater or, different things that might change some of the realities, and the risks for the harbor. Not all breakwaters are bad. There can be, what they did after, Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey is like a significant, they did this living breakwater.
So they
and
did a living shoreline. I was just there in August. And so I can tell you firsthand that it was a big stink and it was a lot of, at least for many, some were totally supportive, but the entire Jersey Shore section that I was in from the state park all the way up has a miles and miles long like man-made engineered sand dune, and it's very natural. It's very clearly like, it's, but if they hadn't done that, this storm that we just had on the 23rd, it breached the 12-foot high sand dune, went over the boardwalk and or roads or into the houses, and And I don't know, I haven't, my friend who lives has a cottage down there, cottage, not a big house, but cottage. Tiny cottage. She's like, oh my goodness, the place is crazy. You want to talk about density? But anyways, they haven't, they're going on Sunday to inspect, the extent of the water, but, it 12 feet high and over and it's flat. So I mean, whatever got over had to have got to at least that first row of houses, or cottages, and there's no place else but in and up, for it to go. There's no change in topography or anything, and
Expensive.
density is insane.
The idea of more permanent structures along the shoreline, and it's just kind of crazy at this point that we would be.
But they talked then, there was a lot of squawking because was friends with her before and during and after Sandy. That a lot of people were really like, oh, they're gonna block my view, and oh, this is so inconvenient, and oh, I'm so mad that they're
that's
gonna do
interesting. I
this this, it's a change, right?
Oh, yeah.
We all get used to what things look like, it's a change, and and now it was like, oh, they built this thing, and now it's not even good enough.
It's not even like.
It's not even good enough, and I thought, well, they could have not built it at all, according to 50% or whatever of the population, and y'all could have been dealing with monstrous flooding or loss of house and boat, and so I was like, aren't you kind of glad you got something?
Right.
It's doing its job, so anyway, so we've spent
Can I just?
all but
ask
7 or
something? Do
8
we want
minutes.
to include something about shoreline, an impact on the shoreline and not just like
For
water habitat?
Yeah.
Yeah, because like, what Dave was mentioning about the pier that was built on Harbor Road
Harbor.
and what happened to the public access and what will happen to the public access.
Right.
Do you want to?
Yeah, it's on there. Yeah, it's in all of the notes and conversations. So, I think just to give 5 or 6 minutes to mention other things that are on the agenda or whatever, and to tie it up. If everybody's okay, I will draft a letter that I'm happy. I'm not at all attached. So when you see it, like when you're like, I don't like that sentence, I'm like, fine, change it. Like, so it's a draft. I'm gonna send it out, and then you can like make
Well, it'd be great for-
suggestions and
As a
verbiage
way,
accordingly.
select board lays, would it be, would you be comfortable reviewing that too? And giving a-
Oh, no, I will. And
Oh, no, I don't like to give my opinion. I pictured, how about,
Thank
Yeah.
you.
sometimes pictures are really helpful for people, and I mean.
And I took a lot of pictures, so I took a lot of time to go to every individual road, and I didn't walk on any private property for public knowledge, and no problem. And I went all down the streets, parked. I did 17-point turns where they told me not to drive on anybody's driveway.
Some of that's even
and-
public right away anyway, don't.
It's fine. I don't care. So it's fine. But I did take pictures because it's interesting, each and every site, which helps to illustrate why third party or local site review is so important, because those minimum standards from a habitat or shoreline standpoint, it's hard to always, there's nuances even from marine to harbor to Eaton, like each one of those is within a quarter mile of shoreline, and they all have very specific nuances and differences. And I mean, any impact on Harbor Road is gonna exacerbate the Japanese knotweed infestation, and the outlet for, and the stream, the perennial stream, which is not what's on Marin, Marin or Marine Avenue. That's actually quite accessible, and is, but some, both vehicular navigation and accessibility, and, so this is again, another example.
That was a conservation commission thing, actually, is that there, historically in Camden, the public access points have been, it was a conservation commission project, like Beacon Ave, and which I didn't totally realize. until somebody told me and I looked it up, but it was the Conservation Commission fighting really hard for some of these. That was an erosion control.
People love that overlook. I mean,
It is pretty cool there.
people love it, especially.
We have an 80-foot right of way on Beacon Ave. It's an 80-foot right of way, like the Curtis Island overlook.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know it by going down that little thing, but it's 80 feet that the town owns.
80 feet along the shoreline,
80
or 80 feet
80 feet along the road.
along the road. Oh, wow.
No, the Beacon Avenue, the Curtis Island overlook is the Beacon Avenue right of way. Beacon Avenue is technically 80 feet wide, even
Okay.
though. And it goes all the way.
That's fabulous.
So we
So,
could-
so Beacon Ave goes up there.
Mhm,
That's 80 feet wide,
mhm.
really?
There's a stream.
I mean, that, I'm not saying we can take everybody's properties.
I was just gonna say, that doesn't seem possible there.
It's not 80 feet wide, but the town,
Maybe this-
you know what I mean, like,
The right of way is 80 feet.
yeah.
The road-
Yeah, I mean, it's just
road
like
plus-
Mechanic Street, the right of way 60 feet wide in some places. Yeah,
Right.
but 80 feet, that's wide.
Wow.
So were there any this is our 4 minutes of other updates. Did you guys get to talk at all about watershed signage or models or
Yes.
anything?
Draft this. We can edit it. And we can tell you a little bit about like why we got with it, but we like having a white background. We just kind of went off other signs that said, keep it clean, we go, always change it. I did this in Canva, which is elements, so the river can change, the trees can change, the mountains can change. But it's just a draft of, I guess, what we were thinking of.
And we would talk about doing it for
Oh, we,
the Goose River or other watersheds as well, but would start with McGuntacook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we learned is, I think we chatted a little bit with the McGuntacook Watershed Association, and they have gone through this before. They stopped because they, you have to go through the DEP to place the signs along the road,
Oh,
from
yeah.
what their understanding was.
DOT.
DOT, sorry.
Don't worry,
Oh, we've got, yeah.
that's
Okay.
what I said.
DOT,
I got that wrong.
so,
So we
Yeah.
were thinking basically all the places like on Route 1 coming in both directions and then the major roads that go by.
Yeah.
Route
52,
105,
105,
52, you know, 173, wherever can and Cam.
There are some good ones too, like
Maybe.
John Street, there's a,
All the town accesses sort of like that.
so let's, but
And maybe
Yeah.
stream and river crossing.
Right,
Wouldn't it be,
Oh, yeah.
I don't wanna, I like what you did, and I think.
we can change this.
No, what I was just wondering is, shouldn't it be like a map of where it is?
well, you know, it gets complicated.
It does.
We looked at, it's.
Did you, I'm just
Yeah.
asking.
We looked at
Yeah.
it, it's so convoluted kind of thing that
It's not a good,
Well, we had an
it's not a good
idea.
graphic.
What we should do is maybe at the next meeting, because it seems like we want to budget. I think the first step we thought about last time was like, what do we need a budget for this? And maybe, I don't know what it takes, how much it costs to make a sign. I think we talked about maybe 6 signs. I don't know.
don't, just, yeah. I
Well,
mean,
we had a list of ideas of places, but it was, we didn't know if there were specific rules.
They could go with that.
don't worry about that part of it.
Yeah.
I'll take care of it.
This, maybe,
You guys just take care of the signs.
Yeah.
How many you want, and I'll make sure they go.
maybe after the next meeting, or we could do a whole bunch of, maybe I could bring a whole bunch of
Few options.
few options, and we can vote on options, or we can adjust options.
I can paint, but I don't like picking the colors.
I just wanted to say at least somewhere like you are entering the,
Well, we did actually feel like there was some, I think, on that, we did want to have some, a few of them that has had entering.
Or leave it.
Like,
right? Well,
Well-
you're entering another one if you're leaving.
yeah, well, some, it's like on Route 1, I think we wanted to be like, but like some of them, yeah, you can write entering, I could add that.
Which is,
I mean, in
that's a
some
big
cases, I
word.
think
so
it's
it's like,
appropriate because it really is.
we could take out keep it clean if we wanted to.
Yeah, we could-
Use
yeah.
that as a, because it takes up more space.
Yeah, we can put McGuntacook.
Just as long as people's an awareness, the idea is that you should be aware that in this watershed area, and most people know what a watershed means.
Some people.
Oh, no, they don't.
No?
They
Okay,
don't.
The reason that we like this was, I think, and you guys, was this, that we had wanted to show the mountains So we actually have like a little bit of Mount Batty stones on top of it, close enough. That's just, and then we wanted to show, I think the perspective of seeing the river kind of coming to you versus seeing it like horizontal was meaningful. And then a little bit of just kind of like rocks. We live in a rocky shore.
No, I think it's a great
And some
graphic.
I need a fish.
We got a fish going.
I need a fish kind of.
Where are all the dams?
Yeah, actually, I think-
Is this a political statement?
Don't people
I
come
think you
to
should have
towns
a
near deer?
fish and I think you should have a loon in there maybe, or a beaver, maybe a beaver.
You're now entering the Montgomery Dam watershed.
Well, no, there's a lot of beavers, there's a lot of ducks, there's a lot, I mean, you want to see kind of,
So there might
Yeah,
be certain
okay.
signs that can be like, could be somewhere where if there's pedestrian traffic, you could maybe see certain
Well,
things, but then.
And, well, the
other
other
ones
thing
when you're.
we kind of threw out, but I don't know, is, we could, I still think those, you know, things that like, they see it like national parks, it's like a stand and it's sort of thing about like this, and
Right.
it tells you a little bit about it.
Mhm.
I think that'd be really handy to have a lot of different spaces where people are walking,
We
like,
could do that too, you could do it
You
like
know,
at the
like-
public landing, or you
Yes.
could
yeah,
do
the
it,
public landing, maybe, you know, along the river walk into places and,
you could do it at the access points,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah,
when
Those
where it crosses over,
what do you call that? What would you call it, like a write up?
what are those things called? Do you know what they're called?
Kiosks, it's kind of a kiosk,
Type
Like
thing?
an info
It's a
kiosk,
or a key, or, yeah.
The diorama.
that goes into more detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, we had a really fun time. We went to waterfront, we had drinks, we all met, and then.
Seriously?
Yeah.
We had
We actually you organized all like.
What happened?
It was like 2 days after our last meeting.
I don't, you didn't, I didn't get, I looked at my phone, I didn't see it. Didn't say Barb, yeah. Barb.
You're not part of the subcommittee.
I don't drink, that's okay.
Do you want to try to set some dates or do you want to just try to meet
sure.
afterward for I'm moving on to I'm calling it the conservation
Isn't
conversations.
that funny?
Oh, we did it.
So I
Have some
spoke to
dates?
Allison and Bobby at Flatbread.
Okay,
They have tons of availability. When I spoke, it was the week of like, it was still in December. But I thought with the holidays, it was like, so thanks for everybody. I feel like I was trying to jam it in. So we can do it anytime.
okay, so you're
I think
totally,
mid-January.
Yeah, you don't want
Honestly,
to,
we can do it whenever.
okay.
Just pick a date,
So let's
mid-January.
throw
I think we just like,
throw some dates out by calendar, or we can hammer it out after the, you know. just-
one thing, your spreadsheet, you can't access it, or at least I
I couldn't
couldn't.
figure out how to do that, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you said add some people in, I'm like.
I know that I
access
did,
You've been
yeah.
locked out.
I'll look at that.
Yeah, I mean, if you
Maybe it's
could,
email or if you want.
I think-
So are we feeling comfortable wrapping
I would
up
like
the
to-
public
yeah.
meeting and we could do subcommittee side
Yeah.
Yeah.
afterwards? Okay, so Allison, we are officially adjourning our meeting at 2:03 PM and we'll